So when we talk about this thing called the dating market, it's an interesting concept. I find a very interesting concept because the idea of a dating market, I think, is very new.
Oh, absolutely.
Because most dating, like that still works, isn't actually a market. It's the older mode of meeting, which maybe you could call it like kinship relations or like, the community
It's
simply, I guess.
community. It's community plus people acceptable by kinship, or in certain cases, even before that, it's like it's a community that you're not part of, but's really close to you, and you can exist in the same physical space. And yeah, I think well, what that has to do is what people desire is usually stupid.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah, and we don't well, but desire is stupid, and finding partners based on desire is totally stupid, and it's mathematically cannot work because
right.
people like what everyone desires, you're not gonna get. So the problem with dating apps is that you like seek out for what you desire. So then it's like it's just a disastrous problem because like most people who like most of the time people we end up with isn't like the exact person you thought you would like whatever desire. And it's I mean, I think there is something true about the fact that, like, both genders, I think, have gotten, like, very inflated standards, but it's definitely true with women because of dating apps. Because
Mhm.
of dating apps, it's like women in real life are, I think, far less like that, but on dating apps, because they have the cream of the they have their pick, right? They will say, like, "Oh, I want a guy who's like this, who's like that," and then guys get it in their head, like, that is all women want. But, I mean, that might be true superficially, but that's not actually true at the level of reality when people actually mingle.
You're listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/one dime to support the show and get access to extra content.
We think that ideology is something blurring, confusing our straight view. Ideology should be glasses which distort our view. And the critique of ideology should be the opposite. Like you take off the glasses so that you can finally see the way things really are.
When you talk about a revolution, most people think violence without realizing that the real content of any kind of revolutionary thrust lies in the principles and the goals that you're striving for, not in the way you reach them.
Philosophers call someone a relativist, by which they mean it's a person that holds that any view is as good as any other view. My simple response to that is this: no one holds that view. No one believes that every view is as good as every other view.
Welcome to Undime Radio. Today I'm here with regular guest of the show, friend of the show, C. Derick Varn, host of his own show called Varn Vlog. He's sort of a veteran in this space of podcasting. He's also probably one of the people I know who just knows the most shit, period, especially about the history of the left and, history of politics. And, I've had you on the show a few times, so you don't have to really, there's not too much background there unless you can maybe detail some of the relationship to right wing politics and the topic of today, which is fascism. The question
Mhm.
of fascism is something that's simultaneously like overdone as a topic on the left, but also something I think is worth addressing to the point where I actually thought of making a whole video essay on fascism because a long time ago, for those who are long time one time listeners, viewers of the main channel, I had two videos. One was called Fascism and the Psychology of Sexual Repression. It was about Reich, and it went on Is Trump a Fascist, in which I used Umberto Eco's list. This was ages ago. I took these videos down because I believe they were wrong. And a lot of people on the left get fascism wrong. And it's a word that's thrown out so much to the point where it loses meaning. But if we understand fascism as a phenomenon, I think there's a lot that we can understand about socialism and 20th century movements and maybe use a different way of thinking to understand our current movements. But without further ado, the first thing I will hit you with is probably a broader question, which is, how useful do you think fascism is as a label today when it comes to explaining the contemporary rise of the far right, because whether there is a rise of a far right is undeniable. The question is like, what do we call this? Do you see fascism as a useful category at all?
This has been a big issue for me because on one hand, there are people who downplay the dangers of the current far right, and and Danny Bezer will go on every show and say, "This is not fascism." Pretty much, only thing is fascism, Italian style, and then maybe Nazism. That's Besner's definition. I have a problem today with the term because what part of fascism or Nazism, and Nazism is a specific form of fascism in and of itself, as I think fascism is a specific form of Bonapartism, and Bonapartism is a specific form of Caesarism that kind of has developed. I don't like most of the left answers for what fascism is. It's capitalism in crisis, it's finance capital. I find that one particularly funny because I actually have a hard time finding the finance capital cores of the fascist states we're talking about. Germany, Romania, arguably the Phalange in Spain, Italy. Those are not places that had strongly developed central banking units. I mean, if fascism is a finance crisis, then you would have saw it in being the dominant form in the Anglosphere. So what is it? I mean, is it useful? I have a deep psychological suspicion that one of the reasons we are addicted to calling things fascist is because it's one of the few times in the Popular Front period where the anarchists, the liberals, and the communists are on the same side, although only after 1941 or whatever. And they agree about a common enemy. That's the only time in history that happens. It's one of the few times where all the parties involved look good, look heroic. And so it becomes a paradigmatic mental model for people. But for example, is Trump a fascist? You know, I went through Enzo Traverso's, criterions on the development of the various forms of the new right, and I was like, well, he's got elements of fascism in there. There's also elements of Cadilloism. There's elements of American unitary executive that's kind of related, but kind of its own thing. What do you want to get out of it? And I just eventually said, you know what? If you want to call Trump a fascist, if that's useful for you, I don't really care. I'm not going to correct you. But the issue that you have is you only have some of the elements commonly associated with fascism. And when you get into stuff like political economy of fascism, the Italian model and the Phalange and the Nazi model are actually very different. So it's even there. It's a little bit because, in Germany, you have something like Shaktism at first, which is kind of a proto Keynesianism that's run by the Nazis. But then they do just integration with the state, but what we might call like neoliberal-esque policies, particularly after the brown shirts emerged. Whereas Italian fascism had large state encouraged unions involved and had a core of both maximalist and syndicalist policy that kind of was maintained, at least in rhetoric, the entire time. And the Phalange had pretty standard conservative economics in Spain. And who knows what the fuck the Iron Guard was getting up to, but like it really doesn't seem to fit either of those models.
The Iron Guard in Romania, for
Yeah,
those who are listening. The Iron Guard at least professed to be super socialist, and so
right.
did the Phalange. But the Phalange, as you mentioned, didn't actually, in practice, weren't really that socialist, which is ironic because the whole thing that like the Phalangists like to say about Franco is that he betrayed the socialistic component,
Mhm.
that he was just a capitalist dictator. But it's like, when was ever Phalangism really socialist anyway?
It's
I
like,
don't know.
wait, betrayed are just never really held up that part in at all. But it's hard to deny, and I know a lot of Marxists do, and I know why they do. But it's hard to deny that the key thinkers of Italian fascism, which is where we should take as our blueprint, because that's the first people who came up with the idea, comes from, and it's a mixture of French ultra-conservatism, the Cirque Prodone, and Sorelian Marxist/anarchism, national syndicalism, and maximalist positions on in socialism. And in Germany, at least until Hitler really comes to dominate, it's also a little bit questionable what their economic policy was. You did have the beefsteak Nazis and the brown shirts, but for the most part, they didn't ever govern particularly socialistically. So it's an interesting question. But even in the case of the beefsteak Nazis and the brown shirts, a lot of them come from the right of the SPD. And I don't mean the Kotsky-Bernstein right that, against Lenin. That's really the center of the SPD. I mean people to the right of Ebert. There are people in the Second International who were pro German expansion and German imperial state for socialism. There were people in the German historical school like Werner Sombart, who started off as Marxists but died Nazis. There was a lot of this, and there's also the National Bolsheviks was a particular German phenomenon, although they weren't really part of the Nazis, although they liked the Nazis. So it's a very strange scenario.
Wasn't Kotsky the left of the SPD though?
Well, he
And
started off as the
Bernstein
left.
sec- yeah.
Right, he starts off as the. I would actually say he's the center left of the SPD because Luxemburg and Liebknecht were to the left of him even when they were in the SPD.
Right, yeah, but they all broke off pretty soon.
Right. Well, so
Yeah.
did Kotsky.
Yeah.
Kotsky joined the USPD, the independent SPD, during the war because he didn't denounce the war, he didn't vote against the war as Lenin went after him, but he actually didn't support the war either, and increasingly pulled out. Bernstein rejoined the SPD later. So this all just is to say that there are a bunch of figures on the right, the true right of the SPD, who really were already integrated in this movement. There was a movement for National Socialism, not Nazi National Socialism, but a kind of actually post-Kantian German historical school National Socialism that Marx made fun of during his lifetime, that does have a lineage where some of those people's descendants become Nazis. But again, they don't really run anything socialistically. So what becomes the key? I went through the Fascism article and the Umberto Eco article, and I actually think that article, even though he's not even describing fascism, his fascism sort of a symbolic thing, everything in that's so vague, I could apply it to George W. I actually did something really snotty in 2015 and applied it to Barack Obama, not because I was saying Barack Obama was a fascist, but just like I can apply this to almost anybody. It is that vague. So what makes fascism unique? Because people will point out, oh, well, the Confederacy was fascist. And I happen to agree with Daniel Besner. That makes no sense to say. Fascism didn't exist yet. You don't go back and just find anything that fascists took ideas from and go back and call it fascist because fascists stole ideas from it later. And nor by me saying that it isn't fascist is me saying it was good. The Nazi race laws were based off of the Southern codes in the United States and the United States National Eugenic Codes. Totally true. Also, not unique to fascism. Eugenics is not unique to fascism.
Racism, not
unique
unique
to
to fascism at all.
Actually, and not all fascists thought that their
that.
integrated state would be based off of race. Mussolini mocked it.
Yeah. He thought race was stupid.
Right. Evola thought that biological racism was too modernist and like too much of a concession. And so did Spengler, by the way, in his Prussian socialism. too much of a concession to dirty modernist pseudoscience. I mean, they didn't really believe in science either, but they were just like, you're only making that appeal because you're already corrupted by modernity.
Because
So,
race science is a new thing. People tend to forget that also. Like race science was literally like 1800s.
right.
That's when it was, coming about. People try to transhistoricize race a lot when they look at previous thinkers or whatever, but it's the actual like race, this idea that there's a, skull measuring and all this shit. Like that's it's a modern phenomenon.
Yeah, it comes from Agaz, the Swiss theorist. It comes from Arthur de Gobineau, which that's around the Civil War. It comes from Fitzhugh in America, who was sociology for the South. That's where this race science stuff really starts to begin, and it's kind of a joint American and French phenomena. Although,
And highly British too, no?
yeah, and British catch up on it very quickly.
Mhm.
But it's what it's even weird when you read 19th century things about race, because sometimes it means what we mean by it, particularly after Gobineau, but sometimes it means nationality, and sometimes it means like meta nationality. Whiteness is really something that you see talked about way more in the British, French, and in the settler colonies. You don't really hear it talked about that much in Europe because it's not actually super conducive to their project. This is interesting because it's based off of a lot of strange readings of linguistic theories. If you've ever wondered, the Indo-European hypothesis, well, that was that racialized. And yes, that was popular even in America in the early 20th century. But again, that's pretty unique to Nazism and some liberal racial authoritarianism in the Anglo world. The Italians didn't endorse it until they kind of had to form an alliance with Hitler, which seemed to be almost born out of practicality.
Against the communists, yeah.
Yeah, against the
Against
communists and
Soviet Union.
and also eventually against the Americans. So it's just
But
something
first,
to
but really, really first was the Soviet Union, right? Because
right.
Roosevelt fucking praised Mussolini earlier on, which is a fact everyone likes to forget.
Roosevelt plays Mussolini. Dewey
John
plays
Dewey,
Mussolini.
John Dewey, the progressive,
Mhm.
the American progressive,
Eh,
left progressive too.
right, and this is one of these things that people forget about. FDR was a big fan until he wasn't. You know, this was this was actually something that we forget. Nazism was never super popular in the United States. Fascism kind of was. And yes, there was the German American Bund. Yes, there was, Southerners who were sympathetic to Nazism. Yes, there was Henry Ford. But frankly, there were a lot more people impressed by the Italians and even the Silver Shirts, which was the American version of Italian fascism. And I find it interesting that we just historically don't talk about them that much. The Silver Shirts was a rather large movement in the United States. So there's all
The
this.
silver shirts.
Yep, the Silver Shirts. They're basically the American black shirts. But
And this is separate from the KKK.
absolutely, they have nothing to do with
Yeah.
the KKK.
Mhm.
The Silver Shirts was explicitly an Italian American group initially. And like I said, it's understudied. People don't talk about it very much. The Klan, the Klan was super racist, but it actually doesn't have a lot of the other elements of fascism. I guess it has a paramilitia element, so you can throw that out, but then most movements at this time had a paramilitia element. So that again, so if you use that, okay, so sometimes you hear, well, fascism has mass mobilization, all right, by paramilitary elements. True, absolutely true. But that's not unique to fascism. One of the difficulties in dealing with fascism is figuring out what actually is unique to fascism. From what I can tell, it is integralist corporatism that is unique to fascism, which is a specific kind of class collaborationism tied into a nation state, but not necessarily, but sometimes also a race.
Yeah, if I were to boil fascism down into 3 characteristics that make it unique, it's one, which you alluded to there, which is the paleogenetic, or as, was it Roger Griffin
Mhm,
characterizes it, the paleogenetic ultranationalism, which is the idea of, like, a people and a nation. It's kind of blood and soil, but the reason why Italian fascism didn't take on the racial component, as you mentioned, but that's very historical to point out because, like, Italian ultranationalism didn't take on a super racialist component because the idea of the people in Italy was based around a common culture, common language, like people in these different Italian city states, because Italy was only a nation like, less than 100 years prior to the rise of fascism, not even half of that, I think. So it was a new nation, and it's like these different city states really, but they're unified on a common culture as opposed to this idea of an Aryan race. So in that context, ultranationalism, which is still very much blood and soil, isn't really racialist in the way that German fascism was, which is very different. But what they both have in common is this people nation based on a foundational myth. But then these two other characteristics I think are more important, which you said about the corporatist
mhm,
economics. The I would say that fascism is ultimately based on a class collaborationist concept of socialism,
mhm.
because fascism in all its forms did purport to be socialist.
Yep.
Didn't It was very anti-communist, but all of them purported to be socialist in one way or another, like Mussolini, Hitler, the Iron Guard, Romania, Phalangism, uh, the Aerocross, Hungary. They all purported to be socialist in some form, but it's a class collaborationist idea and corporatist specifically. So, like when the was it the third period communists, Stalin famously said, "Fascism is the moderate wing of social democracy. The only rational component to that is the class collaborationist concept of socialism. But what's different is corporatism. I'm really explaining this for the audience. Corporatism differs so highly from social democracy because, unlike social democracy, in which the workers' unions are supposed to be theoretically autonomous from the state, corporatism is like the state trying to forcefully unify the capitalists and workers, like mash them together. Which is not, it's not hard to see why Roosevelt liked corporatism because
Mhm.
American America, people often call Roosevelt social democracy, but it was actually closer to corporatism in that, like, it was much more like the state trying to have the unions that were heavily sanctioned away from any communist radicals. So you have like the AFL-CFO, AFL-CIA, as they call it, right? Which is like, yes, you give workers rights, but under a context which, like, any political actors that are hostile to the state are ultimately purged. Fascism is, yeah, corporatist conception of socialism. And the third thing is the T word, which a lot of Marxist-Leninists mainly really don't like, and that's totalitarianism. I think it
Right.
is a real thing. It's really more of a 20th century phenomenon than it is anymore. I don't think there's maybe like two totalitarian states that still exist, like maybe DPRK and Turkmenistan, but it was very much a 20th century phenomenon. And I know people like Lazordo like to act like it doesn't exist, but it very much is a real phenomenon. It's, I think, the one thing Hannah Arendt really does get right about the similarities of fascism and Stalinism. But it's
Mhm.
like, don't take it from me. If I'm pretty sure Mussolini is the guy to invent the word
Yeah, he is.
totalitarianism. He calls it Stato Totalitario. Like he's honest about it. That's what he wants to do, a total state. And, what does that mean? It means things that are like separate from the state, like civil society, whether it be churches, third places, organizations, unions, they cannot be separate from the nation state.
Right.
Ultimate, or if it's in the Bolshevik case, from the communist project, right? So, like, the fucking fascists were very hostile to the church, and they were only made, like, a temporary kind of alliance, but they ultimately, like, saw themselves as, like, partially Republican in that they didn't like any of these separate spheres that they couldn't control.
Mhm.
So, yeah, all these 3 things, you get, like, fascism, And you mentioned these two other terms that are kind of complicated. Well, not really, but like they get thrown around, which is Bonapartism and Caesarism. You said Caesarism. You said fascism is a form of
What's the sub?
Caesarism.
Well, yeah, fascism is a sub. For me, fascism emerges as a sub form of Bonapartism with a particular idea of the state, and Bonapartism is a modern liberal form of Caesarism. It's not the only liberal form of Caesarism either, to be quite frank. French absolutism, tot court, is also a liberal form of Caesarism. It is very different than medieval absolutism and medieval monarchism. And that is
Wait, when you
something
say
that
liberal Caesarism, what do you mean by that?
I mean that they tried to run a capitalist state with a king, and like
Okay,
the
yeah.
development of mercantilist capitalism in
But that's not
France.
very liberal though. Like the mercantilism,
I would
kind of what the
say
liberals are opposing.
I would
Like,
say that if you are dealing with a modern economy, you are dealing with the origins of a battle over what liberalism was going to be. And I agree with Alan Mirkins Woods that French absolutism was an attempt of a different path into into that world. It didn't work. I mean, I don't think it could have worked, but I pointed out because I think it would also be like wrong to call Louis the 15th or Louis the 14th or any of those guys, Louis the 16th, a Bonapartist. That would be weird. But it is, I would call them Caesarist, for example, actually. And so I think that's something to keep in mind. And I also think one of the weird things with Bonapartism, and if you read Z.F. Sternhill, he talks a lot about this. There are different forms of it even in France. There's the mainline Bonapartist. It's represented by, by Napoleon III, even Bonaparte himself. But there's also Boulanger and Blanqui and and Blanquet in particularly, which was populist in origin, although it leaned mostly right. There were some Blanquists who liked him. They were also Bonapartists. They just lost. Their coup d'etats failed. So, and Sternhell actually traces the origins of fascism in specific to three things, which is revolutionary syndicalism by George Sorel, and it's when it starts going nationalist, and we know that Sorel praised Mussolini, for example. He was alive for that. The
and Lenin.
yeah, he praised Lenin too. Yes, and Lenin praised Giovanni Gentile, who's also important to Italian fascism. I mean, there's a
He's the
lot of
real.
stuff
Well,
here
he's the
that
Steve Bannon of Italian fascism.
right.
Gentile. He's like the brain of Italian fascism, as they say.
Yeah, he is a philosopher. I mean, so you have the Cercle Proudhon, you have the which was a kind of French radical group. You have revolutionary syndicalism by George Sorel, and you have Boulangism. Ironically, though, even though these are all French developments, they are kind of they don't really take off in France. They take off in Italy and Spain. Their origins are in France, but they take off in Italy and Spain. So I do think understanding Bonapartism, which is why I say fascism, is a sub form of it. I think most American presidents have been Bonapartist. I think very few are any kind of
Well,
fascist.
actually, wait, because you threw around the words Caesarism and Bonapartism. Do you see those as separate things, or are you using them as synonyms? I see them as
They're
separate things.
separate. I see them as separate. Well, I see
So
one
I
as
would
a subset of the
differentiate them.
other. So
Yeah, I see it as all Bonapartism is Caesarism, and not all Caesarism is Bonapartism.
correct.
Like you know, correct me if I'm wrong, but the way I see it is like Bonapartism. Because okay, first of all, what is Caesarism? Caesarism is ultimately the attempt of a demagogue. So it's demagoguery to appeal to the masses, to the people. Essentially, it appealed to a certain sense of democracy to base their legitimacy. So when the system is failing, they ultimately, appeal to the people by, doing popular shit, and they concentrate power. And that's why it comes from Caesar, because Caesar ultimately appealed to the poor and against the aristocracy, but ultimately dissolved what was existed of the separation of powers in the Roman Republic and paved the way for the transition to a more kind of autocratic system,
Yeah.
making the temporary dictatorship permanent. But like So like Bonapartism though isn't it like in a context of a revolutionary situation, the Bonapartism appeals to certain aspects of the revolutionary current while ultimately being a Caesarist in that they are a dictator or dictatorial figure that will concentrate power and ultimately subvert the revolution.
Right.
But they come into being, they come into power in the context of a revolutionary situation. So like the first Bonapartist, I mean, is like Napoleon,
Right.
or the, as things
So
usually described, right? Yeah.
so I
The
think of
first Napoleon.
Bonapartism is a specific phenomenon either in a liberal crisis or in a liberal revolutionary crisis, and usually the the latter, although we have seen Bonapartist figures emerge and breakdown of liberal political legitimacy. And I mean liberal in the proper sense, not just my vague everything modern is vaguely liberal sense. So Bonaparte is an example of that. You have a breakdown when basically when the mountain and the French Revolution, aka the Jacobins, exhaust themselves and create a crisis with that exhaustion, and the social forces are literally killing each other. You have the emergence of a person who appeals to two contradictory things. Those contradictory appeals do go back to Caesarism. Caesarism is weird in that it is autocratic and populist simultaneously. So it is different from, say, our ideas about absolute monarchy, which actually probably never actually existed even in France, where where absolute rule and a unitary executive is justified by some non-popular ideological conception like the divine right or whatever. The appeal of Caesarism is an appeal to the people to legitimate your rule. And ironically, one of the funniest things I think I ever read was Michael Parenti's book on Caesar, which is bad, just so people know. I mean, like classical historians, but he basically tries to portray Caesar as a clear populist and good, as a predecessor to the dictatorship of the proletariat, so that you can also defend Stalin. And everyone who's read every classicist or Soviet historian who's read that book is like, "What are you on?" The Parenti fans tend to not pay attention to that book now because it's kind of embarrassing.
Well,
But
well, actually, that's an interesting book. I've mentioned this. I think I don't know if it might have been to you actually,
Mhm,
but both Michael and Christian Parenti have a similar book about different people. And
mhm,
I like Christian Parenti. I've had him on the show before. He has a book on Hamilton, which I think is in a certain way oddly similar to the Parenti book on Caesar,
mhm.
in that there's a kind of tacit endorsement there of Bonapartism, like ultimately. I mean, or at least I wouldn't actually say Bonapartism, but like of Caesarism, of demagoguery, basically, of being able to carry out the will of the people, quote unquote, through a very centralized autocratic system. Because like Michael gets right
Mhm.
about Caesar is the fact that like why was he popular?
Right.
He did appeal to the people, and he did ultimately stick it to the aristocrats who were being assholes to the force. So like he's right about that. But what's funny is the precursor to dictatorship of the proletariat, which tells you everything about what he thinks the dictatorship of the proletariat is, and
Right.
the issue with Marxism-Leninism. Because I wouldn't go as far as to say Michael Parenti was a Stalinist, because he doesn't really defend Stalin as far as I've seen in his book, but he does defend like a lot of shit the Soviet Union does. And yeah,
Yeah, I don't think I don't think he was a Stalinist because I don't think he was a Marxist-Leninist. I think he was a Soviet defensist who actually goes further by accident than most Marxists do, which is kind of funny. I mean, I actually I like his parts of, at least. There are some flaws with it, but I like his brown shirts and reds, like I do. But I read the Caesar book. I read it even before I was a Marxist. I just remember making fun of it for years. But nonetheless, I guess my point is Bonapartism in specific happens when there is a crisis in a liberal polity, usually during the revolutionary period, where you pull in different elements and usually different class strata It's usually those class strata that are in between things. So the lumpen, the petty bourgeoisie, the rich peasantry, etc. So people who aren't quite in a clear category in Marxist ways of thinking. When the Marxists explain Bonapartism, they say that's the base of the Bonapartist figure. And some people, and this was popular during Trump 1, I remember people like pulling that up as like, oh, well, that's the base of fascism. Therefore, Trump is fascist. And I was like, no, what you're actually saying is Trump is emerging from a liberal crisis, pulling from various strata, downwardly mobile, formerly well-off proletarian, the we might call labor aristocrats who are no longer getting the aristocratic part, the petite bourgeoisie in the rural areas, and failing parts of capital. Trump 2 is actually a different coalition, which makes that harder to talk about. But again, they're like, oh, well, that's fascism. I'm like, well, not really, because that describes every Bonapartist figure. And I actually agree with you, although I don't think this is necessarily a good thing the way Christian Parenti does. I've always thought if Hamilton got his way, we'd be talking about Hamiltonism and not Bonapartism. That's my,
Mm.
view of him.
Yeah, I mean, well, I would say his Hamilton book is not so much an endorsement of Bonapartism as it is like a Caesarist conception of like how to do things that are good for the people. And this is the
Mhm.
odd commonality that Marxist-Leninists have with, you know, fascists, frankly, but also just, you know, that kind of politics. It's this understanding that like you want to do something that's for the people, but this bourgeois democracy or this system doesn't allow you to carry that out, which, there's truth in that, right?
Mhm.
But then they'll kind of believe in this idea like you can have a very powerful leader just carry that out, which is, part of why I think the unitary executive theory like is problematic as it is for what it means, which is basically dictatorship, or soft dictatorship. It's not like that foreign to American constitutionalism. In fact, I kind of actually think unitary executive theory is much closer to the founders' vision than, Wilsonianism, right? The idea of the administrative state, which is explicitly a break from that.
Yeah, no, I
No, because it's like, yeah, if you not just Hamilton, but even Madison basically like believes in a lot of what Hamilton believes in, minus the kind of leader for life, and like he believed in an elected monarch.
I hold that there's a fundamental contradiction in the founders in the United States, actually, that some of them saw an elected quasi-monarchical position as a representative of the people. A majority of them saw the legislature as that. However,
Jefferson,
yeah.
yeah,
However, you have to remind
Jefferson's
yourself,
the good one
yeah,
on that.
yeah, well, it's not just but it wasn't just the anti-federalists who saw it that way. But you have to remind yourself that they did think that there should be a strong executive, but the executive should come from the votes of the legislature originally. So it is still coming from the body that they see as embodying the authority of the people. And whereas the administrative executive state, which is it merges after Wilson, yeah, I don't think, I think that's totally foreign to the founders. I think it's frankly, it, it's it emerges in my mind. I talked recently on Antifada how I actually break the American Republic into 5 republics, like I think we should have. But since there's no revolutions between, or the revolutions aren't obvious, we don't talk about them this way. So I like, you got the revolution to the Civil War, which is the classical Republican period. You have the Civil War to about 1890, which is the national Republican period, where we have national consolidation and a national state and a national identity here, which we really didn't have before the Civil War, not in a coherent way. And then 1890 to Wilson, which is a kind of breakdown actually of that national republicanism. And then administrative state 1, Wilson, to about the 1960s, administrative state 2, where we start focusing on the judiciary to fix problems and not even the administration under the legislature. And that's 1960s to about 2001. And then post 2001, a crisis republic where everything is justified increasingly off crisis, which, by the way, to bring us back to the Bonapartism, would be why we'd be primed for a Bonapartist figure again. But we've had them before. I think Reagan's a Bonapartist figure. I think Kennedy was a
Wait,
Bonapartist
wait.
figure.
So you say Bonapartist? Do you mean like why not just use the term like Caesarist?
Because I
Because
don't,
where's
I
the
think it's,
revolutionaries? Like, is this what's the revolutionary situation that they are really co-opting and responding? That's really where I see the difference between Bonapartism and
so you
Caesarism.
think that Bonapartism only emerges in a revolutionary situation, and I would
Yeah.
say it emerges in a crisis situation, of which revolution is always a subset of. So
What would be the situation of that like Kennedy or Reagan are really,
Reagan is a
res
response to the inability to navigate a financial crisis. Kennedy is a response to the exhaustion of a warfare state. So, and also actually he is a proto neoliberal. Kennedy ironically is a proto neoliberal. I mean,
yeah.
like, so it's these are major shifts. You can
Thing
call
is,
them Caesarist.
it's the
The
reason
thing
why
is,
it's 'cause, like,
Mhm.
Bonapartism, I see much more, like, in the context of a political revolution in which they take aspects of that, but ultimately dissolve and liquidate the revolution. Like, like, Nasser to me is a good example of Bonapartist.
Mm.
Nasser, you could say Saddam, although you could say the guy before Saddam as well. Um, really, like, a lot of the pan-Arab dictators, I mean, they come to power in a really big movement,
They
and
come to
they
power in a national consolidation movement, basically, and their revolutions tied to that. So that's fair.
and in Egypt's case, I mean, there's a communist movement too,
I
and,
guess maybe I should clarify because I also think that like I tend to divide like Bonapartism, like fascism is a sub to me because fascism does emerge in revolutionary situations
yes,
most of the
I
time.
would say fascism is Bonapartist.
But like Caudilloism is by your definition would not always be Bonapartist, but it would be Caesarist. And for those of you who don't know what that is, that's Latin American dictators who do populist policies, left or right. I mean,
Yeah,
Caudilloism has both flavors.
or like
Bonapartism has
Peronism,
both flavors, you know?
or like Peronism,
Yeah, Peronism
right.
is an example. Most of the Pinochetism is the right wing example,
Well, I think, yeah, I think actually Pinochet is an odd example almost of like, is he even either? Because he doesn't appeal to the demos
True.
or revolution. It's like just like a pure
He's
counter
actually more of
revolution.
just an old fashioned military juntas.
Yeah,
Uh,
sometimes we have to be comfortable. Sometimes just saying like they're just like a dictator, like just a old military man to shut down revolution. Whereas like I think Bonapartism does shut down revolution, but it does so while like taking aspects of it.
So,
Like
like
hence
Obrador, not the current Obrador, but the original one. For people who don't know,
of
and not,
Mexico.
yeah, and AMLO, like AMLO is a descendant of the Obrador, who's kind of the central figure who emerges as the coalition of which the liberal factions of the Mexican Revolution can align with when it ends. And I see him as a Bonapartist figure. He sets up the PRI runs a party state kind of for a long, long time. I mean, like most of the 20th century, the Party of the Revolution Institucional runs Mexico. And I would not say most Mexican presidents beyond Obrador are Bonapartist. And then but then you also have other figures like Diaz is an authoritarian figure. I don't know that I would consider him Bonapartist though, because he's a pre-revolutionary crisis figure. So, these things get tough because it's like, okay, where do you think the revolutionary crisis begins and ends? One of the things about I mentioned Boulanger in France. Well, that's another one of the people think the French Revolution. Well, how many French revolutions were there in the 19th century? Like there's at
Right.
least three. So
Yeah.
it's so
Third Republic. There's like 1844.
Right.
There's Third Republic.
1844, arguably 1888. Like there's a
Mhm.
bunch. So you have
Well, I
these.
mean, it's worth talking about the one that Marx wrote about, the
Mhm.
third Napoleon, because that I think that is like the quintessential Bonapartism. Just also like Napoleon the First, he responds to the 1844 revolutions
Right.
and is kind of like basically appeals to the peasants. He's
He
very
appeals to
popular
the
with the
peasants,
peasants.
the lumpen bourgeoisie, and the
Mhm.
petit bourgeois.
Yeah.
Like,
And
and
ultimately does put like the bourgeoisie in check while also kind of stabilizing the order for him.
yeah, he does
Yeah.
better at stabilizing the order, even though he's a con man, than the party of order does. It's, you know, I mean, I do think like when I tell people like when they talk about Trump, I'm like, well, you have a problem because this is not really a revolutionary situation. So if I take that, then he doesn't quite count as a Bonapartist, but he's
Yeah,
a
I'd say he's a
similar figure.
Caesarist.
Okay, so you think he's a Caesarist? All
Yeah,
right,
I called him a Caesarist on Twitter, and a lot of people are confused because they think that if you don't say fascism, you're trying to say he's like not as bad. And I don't even view things in that spectrum. Like fascism doesn't necessarily mean more bad, and more bad doesn't mean more fascist. Like first of all, fascism. This is a lot of lefties have trouble thinking. Fascism is not the furthest thing on the right.
No, not at all.
It's not. I mean, it actually saw itself, at least in the Italian case, and to some extent the German case. Although the German case is definitely very far right. They saw themselves both as neither left nor right. They're definitely on the right, at least in relative to the spectrum in which they come about in. You know, like relative, they're right compared to the left. That's for sure.
I grew up in
But
a
they're
time
not like monarchists are more right wing than fascists are.
a monarchist, any kind of explicit theocrat, and most fascists are not theocratic fascists. They're Phalange is a little questionable, and the Iron Guard is a little questionable. But in general, fascists are not fond of religion, but they'll tolerate it. And if they do use religion, it is to create a synthetic ideology almost. There's a lot of that going on in fascist circles. I mean, you and I would say, what is fascism? And this is going to make a lot of people uncomfortable. But I do think a lot of Marxists really want to erase the fact that most of the key thinkers of fascism, not most of the key foot soldiers, they do have a different class origin, but most of the key thinkers of fascism come out of either the social democratic movement or the syndicalist movement. They break from our tradition, but they are from it. That was why when Stalin talked about third periodism and said pretended social democrats were the same thing as, they were just social fascists, that wasn't as absurd as it initially sounds to us today, because there were social democrats who became fascists. There were lots of them, and are specifically Nazis. I mean, I know Paul Gottfried, for example, is like, should we even call the Nazis fascist? I think they are, but they're the weirdest one. They're 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 not like the other. They're different than everybody else we talked about. They're way more racialist. They are. They probably have the most right-wing economic policy by the time Hitler's actually running things. They're, I mean, all fascists tend to be expansionist, but they're really expansionist and explicitly basing what they're doing as settling the East. That's off of an American context. The thing that makes fascism so hard to deal with for people is it pulls from all three of the major modern traditions of politics: conservatism, liberalism, and socialism. It does. It pulls from everybody.
Well, in the Nazi case, they pull from everybody. That's for sure. Like the way I like to understand it is Italian fascism emerged as a kind of mirror of Bolshevism.
Mhm.
It was like I call it, I think Paul Gottfried in that book you're alluding to, Fascism: Career of a Concept, which if you have some criticisms of, we can get into that after. But it's an
I think
interesting
people
book.
should read it, though.
I do. I really recommend it. I mean, that's where I learned all that shit about Roosevelt praising Mussolini and all that stuff. Leftists always leave out. That's the thing about leftist chronologies of fascism is they really like to, be like, one thing that really pisses me off is this idea of scratch a liberal and the fascist bleeds.
Hmm.
But it's like throughout history, I mean, that's just as true of a lot of socialists. I mean, like not like in general, but what I mean is that socialism is not fascism isn't any more closer to liberalism than it is to like that is to Bolshevism or even anarcho-syndicalism in weird ways. It's kind of like a hybrid of many things, but yeah, I see Italian fascism. It emerges as a kind of phony socialism, and it is a response to the Italian left and the rise of Bolshevism in Soviet Union. Because I mean, it's literally like 2 years after. It marched on Rome's what, like 1921, and
I
in
mean,
Italy, you
yeah.
have like a split between the communists and socialists. Socialist Party, which is once big, it splits between the kind of maximalists, Bolshevik types like Bordiga and Gramsci, and then the kind of more moderates. Italian fascism, like it takes actually the kind of tactics of Bolshevism, explicitly so too. That's another odd thing, is Mussolini seemed to have like a odd respect for Trotsky,
Yeah.
like in his just vigilance and ability to, you know, ultimately know how to use power. He respected the Bolsheviks' power. So fascism emerged kind of is like a mirror of Bolshevism. Nazism, I see it as a mirror of, Bolshevism by the time Stalin's taking over, and a mirror of British and American racism
Yeah. I
and
wouldn't go that
imperialism.
far.
Hannah
It's
Arendt
just
actually
the
makes that point too.
Nazism that you're not, which is all the right guard immigrants that fled into Germany really do influence a specific period of anti-Semitism. That actually does come out of the Russian right. But
Mm.
that is one thing when I think about, like, so you have Sternhill, that's one thing he leaves out that I think is actually really important, is you have all these right immigrants. But I would say that's just influencing their anti-Semitism. That's where the German anti-Semitism talking points come from. That's not where their political economy comes from. They're not trying to reinstall a czar, So, that's the only element I would add. And yeah, Godfrey comes out of a particular tradition. I mean, he comes out of the paleoconservative end of James Burnham. So he actually sees Keynesianism, Keynesian liberalism, fascism, Nazism, and Marxist-Leninism as all managerial ideologies. They're just about managing massive production. And in America, fascism caused a crisis that he actually implies progressivism for was closer to Italian fascism than most people want to admit. But once Italian fascists sided with the Nazis, a whole lot of progressives started rebranding their stuff as liberal, as to distance themselves from both the Bolsheviks and the fascists, even though, as he points out, a lot of their ideas are corporatist explicitly. So it's an interesting problem. Another thing that has happened in the 20th century is Brazilian fascism tends to be Catholic integralism. So that is the fascist idea of the state tied to religion. And that has seen a resurgence in America with these post-liberal rightists and national conservatives. But they don't take all of it. And what they aren't is they don't want civil society completely subordinated to the state, even though they want it more integrated with the state. That's implied in integralism and corporatism. Yeah, I remember in the aughts, people discovered that Mussolini thing about corporations, and they were like, they would just throw at George Bush. They're like, "Oh, corporatism is fascism," and I would be like,
Oh yeah, yeah.
"What
Bill Maher.
corporatism meant?"
Yeah, Bill Maher. I remember that exact Bill Maher moment when he says, "Well, the Mussolini defined fascism as when the state and corporations collaborate." George Bush is a fascist, and it's like they don't understand that that's actually like Mussolini's collaborationism of socialism is, and I say this with not to disparage, our social democrats, but like Bernie in a real sense, in that, like, I mean, or actually not to use Bernie because Bernie's probably more like a social democrat. Social democrat. It's closer to Roosevelt,
Right.
right? It would be closer to Roosevelt.
I mean, it is funny, and I hate to give libertarians credit, but libertarians actually do trot this definition of fascism out. This is where I was first exposed to it in the paleoconservative right, was them talking about strong leaders trying to manage the economy by fiat being a fascist phenomenon that even now, of course, that's a very thin definition for all the reasons we talked about before. But they would point out that FDR praised Mussolini and stuff like that. Paul Godfrey pointed out, I hate to say it, even neoconservatives like Jonah Goldberg pointed it out in his otherwise very stupid book, Liberal Fascism. But there are some historical facts in there. And so I went through this and I kind of came to the conclusion that, like, I don't know that fascism is super useful for today. Nor one thing I tried to tell someone that made them really uncomfortable is I was like, well, I said Bonapartism, but I kind of agree with you. Now I think about it, maybe it is Caesar. Trump is a Caesarist. He could be worse than a fascist. I don't fucking know. We're not done yet. Like, uh, and also fascists are the only people who've killed millions of people. Like, let's be frank here. The late 19th century and early 20th century is a killing field. And if you just call all of it fascist, it makes fascism not mean anything but bad. Which is not particularly helpful. But man, do people get mad when I'm like refuse to say it, or when I say, like, I don't care at this point, call it what you want, because none of you agree on what like, very few of you bother to define fascism except occasionally in that vague ass Umberto Eco way that applies to almost everything. I mean,
It
like,
applies to
literally,
China today.
yeah, it would. That applies to China. I mean, like I said, it's a stretch, but you could stretch it to apply to Barack Obama. I mean, it's just like mythic past, strong. I mean, like, everybody does that. That's
Yeah.
kind of a political move, which was the reason why. And to defend Eco a little bit, he didn't think he was describing fascism. He thought he was describing these, like, semiotic forces that are pre-fascist that come up over and over again. That's why he called it fascism. Like,
Right. Yeah.
but I was just like, still not helpful.
I have with Adorno too. Is like there's this tendency in the post-war era to like define authoritarianism and fascism as like synonymous ideas. And
Yeah.
really, like, Echo, if it's useful for anything, that list, it's psychology of authoritarianism, maybe, but like fascism is very specific. Like, it just is. I mean, we can get into it, but I think fascism is socialism in crisis.
Yeah, no, you and I actually probably agree on this. I told you that I think socialism is capitalism in crisis, which would really piss a lot of socialists off. But then, the crisis enables us to depart from capitalism. But it does come from that crisis. And I think fascism is like the socialist weird nationalist mirror. And frankly, there is a truth to the fact that socialists have provided the great majority of fascist intellectuals. It is also true that they have appealed to different segments of society and the class, although the idea that there were no fascist workers is just false. And when we're talking about Germany, the KPD and the KPD are both tiny, and the SPD is shrinking massively from unpopularity in the 20s. So, it wasn't like there were mass forces there. And the other thing that people have a trouble dealing with in Germany in particular is there were groups that even I would call fascistic that opposed the Nazis. And that's something that, like, people have a hard time wrapping their head around. But I'm like, yeah, there were other forms, like Prussian socialists, like Spinglerists and stuff. They weren't Nazis. They contributed to Nazi ideology indirectly, absolutely. But I mean, frankly, though the conservative revolutionists tried to kill Hitler more than the socialists ended up doing, probably because the socialists were in camps. But like, they actually almost killed him more than once. Whereas, socialist and the liberal, there's a reason why you don't hear much about the White Rose Society, which was a liberal opposition to Hitler. They are all dead. They'd be all dead, but they were all dead before even the height of the war. So, it's something that I think the history of fascism makes people uncomfortable. I think of the left wingers who write about this, I think Claire Mattei, if you got her off air, although some of her stuff makes MMTers uncomfortable, but I would say that, Keynesianism plus the unitary executive is actually the same, responding to the same kind of crisis with the same kind of appeal to manage capital. But the one thing I would say to her on that is it doesn't have that many Caesarist elements after FDR. So FDR definitely does, but after FDR, it's way more administrative. And so it's hard to see the same Caesarist, Bonapartist, fascist, family resemblances, even though I do think it is an attempt to manage crises of the capitalist state without bloodshed and or massive financial panics. But I just find most historiography on fascism to frankly be kind of bad, except for Zeev Sternhill. I think Paul Gottfried's book is kind of good. I think he's too soft on Italian fascism. But I don't think, once you read the book, I don't think you can completely write it off, because most of his stuff is just purely historical in that book. And I
Yeah,
think he
the
is
one
also
issue
right.
I've
Fascism just becomes a moving target after the war. We just start applying it to everything. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think Paul Gottfried's book, if there's one issue I have with it, it's, I don't know why, but he insists on saying that Italian fascism wasn't actually really all that totalitarian compared to, Nazism and Stalinism. And it's like, that is like in a literal sense true, but that's also not because it's not totalitarian in essence. It's also just because Italy had a less state capacity compared to Germany and Russia. So it's like that idea that, Italian fascism wasn't that crazy totalitarian compared to Nazism and Stalinism. It reminds me almost of like the Lazardo Stalin defense, which is, well, he didn't control everything. So is it really totalitarianism? But no, it's also because Russia is so big and they couldn't. Or in the
Right.
same sense that like China was always less totalitarian than like Soviet Union, because China is even more like kind of geographically diverse. So it's just they couldn't.
Ethnically, both the Soviet Union
Ethnically, yeah.
and China are ethnically diverse, but China's really ethnically diverse. So it has always been. Like,
Mhm. Much less like urbanized.
yeah,
So
absolutely.
they couldn't just do that total state thing, even if they wanted to. But I think, yeah, fascism is totalitarian in essence. Like that's a big part of it. It's what makes them like very illiberal. They have, I think, if there's anything they maybe borrow from liberalism, it's maybe republicanism, in that they oppose like constitutional monarchy and they oppose like religion, but they also believe in its function. They just want the state to replace it. But they're illiberal in that they don't believe in separations of powers, and they believe that this all gets in the way of manifesting the people's will, which is something that is interesting because this is like a Bolshevik commonality with, I say Bolshevik because I don't like to say communist. Right? It annoys me is when Paul Gottfried, because it says anti-communism, he says communism and fascism have this in common, but like communism is so diverse. I don't even think Marxism is inherently totalitarian or anything at all. But like Bolshevism wasn't even totalitarian either. It just it became so, right? And it's not just the circumstances. People like to say, "Oh, it's the circumstances. They had to do it, whatever." But it's also in the way they conceptualize the state. You know, I'm like designing a course on political thought, And one thing I want to assign is Carl Schmitt and Trotsky together. Because in the Crisis of Representative Democracy, which is one of Schmitt's main books, and Terrorism and Communism by Trotsky, they almost make an identical case for the total state, but in different ways. Schmitt's at least more honest about it, but they both do the thing, which is, parliamentary liberal democracy. It's actually not very democratic. It has nothing to do with democracy. In fact, it's really all about like delegation between elite interests. I mean, partially true, right? At the time, at least. And Trotsky does this thing where it's like the dictatorship of the proletariat can better manifest the people's will, except that unlike Marx's dictatorship of the proletariat, which is just really radical representative democracy, of a sort, that he saw in the Paris Commune, Trotsky is ultimately believing in a dictatorship of a party. And then Schmitt, a dictatorship of a party, but really like a person. And they both say like this dictatorship can better manifest the people's will. And that historically, this idea of dictatorship and democracy being totally separate, that's not necessarily true. Parliamentarism has nothing to do with democracy. But so they'll say the thing which is like dictatorship isn't actually that any more or less democratic, but also this system, we can't get anything done. So we need more dictatorship, and so you have this like waffling, but ultimately they make a case for a state that doesn't have any checks on it.
Yeah, Michel Robert actually he comes out of Germany, ends up in Italy. He was an anarchist at first, but he makes the same argument to support fascism eventually, because he's just like, well, we can manifest the total state, which is a manifest of the will of the people, by breaking up things that seem democratic but are actually oligarchical and replacing them with a responsive dictator. And that idea was pretty popular in the early 20th century. I mean, it kept on emerging in different groups at different times over and over and over again. I guess the difference between Robert and Trotsky is Robert sees this in a personage that may be represented by a party, whereas Trotsky sees it in a party. And it's pretty clear to me, having read a ton of Draper and whatnot, that Marx sees it in a class. And the reason why I say that is because Marx also is arguing with Blanqui, who sees it as a party dictatorship too. And Marx's critique of Bakunin makes no sense if you assume that he wanted a party dictatorship that was ran by a minority of the population. And I would tell people to read, when they read Communism and Terrorism, I would say read the other side of it, which was the letters Kautsky sent to Trotsky about that, because one of the interesting things there is basically Kautsky accuses, the reason why you're doing this is your revolution is in crisis because it's premature. You didn't go through bourgeois development, and now you have to do all this stuff, and you're going to have egg on your face, basically, and you're going to have to use terror because of not just to depose the dispossessions, but to keep society together, because you don't have a class large enough to actually run this society. You have too much of a peasantry. You haven't developed enough. And when you combine that with the fact that Plekhanov started talking about party dictatorship as early, the dictatorship of the proletariat, but started redefining it kind of as a party dictatorship as early as 1903, you can see why the Russian context is so important for all this, because it's a long tradition there. But basically everybody floated. I mean, I have complained recently to people who are like, oh, what Trump is doing is totally unprecedented. And I'm like, no, this goes back to Wilson and the Roosevelts, at minimum. Yes, Trump's doing McKinleyism, but his idea of executive power and like the power over tariffs and all this started coming in the 20s and 30s, when Congress started ceding powers that constitutionally it is questionable that they could have even ceded to the executive. That's a trend now of 100 years that we've been doing that. It's either been ceded to the executive, the judiciary, or the administrative state. And the administrative state's under the executive anyway. So, this has been the tendency now for a long time. And while I would say we're not in a revolutionary situation, and maybe not even in a an economic crisis exactly. I mean, we are now, but it's kind of being manufactured. But we have been in a political crisis now for at least 30 years, maybe 60. So that's my take on why things rhyme so much. But yeah, I think I think you know, I talk about the fights over the F word as just futile because in some ways, frankly, people don't know enough about fascism's history to even engage in it other than Nazis bad. And when we talk about fascism in school, we always do use the Nazis as a paradigmatic example. And like I've said, and I mean, Sternhau, Griffiths, Godfrey, the one thing they all agree with is Nazis are the weird case out. And there are even kind of post fascist ideologies and groupings like Dugin, for example. He explicitly pulls from fascist thinkers all the time, but he uses the Nazis as his out for why he's not fascist. Oh, we don't have the racism. We're just a civilizational state. And I'm like, the Italians didn't explicitly endorse racism either. So, I mean, this is an old game that people can take advantage of because people do not recognize the historical ideologies of fascism beyond like nationalism and xenophobia. You know, that seems to be where they think it stops. And I'm like, well, xenophobia has been all over the place historically, and nationalism's been a thing since at least the Treaty of Westphalia. So I don't know that that's going to get you any clarification.
Yeah, so this fascism and is socialism in crisis thing,
Mhm.
because we're responding to, of course, is this idea that fascism is capitalism in crisis. And that's like the most common thing people just like on the left, mainly Marxists, will just kind of parrot over and over again. Fascism is capitalism in crisis, and the idea goes is that like yeah, capitalist crisis produces a situation that could potentially be revolutionary, and fascism is ultimately brought about by, depending on which Marxists you ask, either just the petite bourgeoisie or a coalition of petite bourgeoisie and finance capital, or petite bourgeoisie and national capital. They don't tend to really agree on that part, but basically parts of the bourgeoisie and petite bourgeoisie, they agree to like back fascism and unleash it on the socialists and the workers, almost as a way to like resurrect capitalism while putting down any threats, revolutionary threats that this crisis could lead to. And even like people who don't believe there is fascism kind of say this. Like Norm Finkelstein recently was saying, well, what we have isn't fascism because there's no left, and if there's no revolutionary left, there's no fascism. And I think he's partially right in that, like, I think Trump is a different phenomenon than fascism, and same with much of the far right in Europe too. It still, like, I don't think fascism necessarily requires there to be like a left to respond to. In fact, I actually think fascism is a response to a failure of socialists to meet the yearning for socialism.
Mhm.
That's why I say it's socialism in crisis, because while fascism definitely is a direct response to socialism in like the Italian case, very much is a direct response, it's also enabled because of the socialists failed. Like the
Absolutely.
socialists were the party got like, was the biggest party in parliament in the 1919 elections, but by 1921 they like totally lost all that because they had a split. They had a huge catastrophic split, and they got like third place in the elections prior to like the March on Rome. And ultimately, there's like just so much divides in the left, and there's anarchists, there's communists, and the Socialist Party. The Italian fascists are able to take power and also appeal to aspects of that zeitgeist, that socialist zeitgeist. In the German case, as you mentioned, the communist parties were not big at all. Like by the time the Nazis came to power, German Revolution had happened like way over a decade before, more than
Right.
that,
And
and
failed utterly. But
failed completely. So like it wasn't coming to power in a situation where like the bourgeoisie needed them to like defeat the left or whatever, right?
Mhm.
It really wasn't. but you had ultimately they appealed to certain aspects of socialism that would be obviously popular in such a dire situation. So they met that yearning. So it's like I view it really as like socialism in crisis in the sense that it appeals to that, and that's why I think was it Sartre who said Jean-Paul Sartre who said fascism is socialism for the fools?
Yeah.
Right. I think that is actually a much better like term. Then there's also the quote behind every fascism is a failed revolution.
Right. Which is from often used by Zizek, but it's from Benjamin. So
Walter Benjamin. Yeah,
yeah.
that's right. Yeah, I think those actually make much more sense as like quotes that describe what fascism really is. Like you can't understand it without understanding the socialist component. Because that's what makes it ultimately unique as a kind of
Right. Why
reactionary
it's just
movement.
not any other kind of closet, like normal bog standard reactionary that's emerged since the 16th century. Right. Like,
Yeah.
you know,
And they'll say, well, in practice, it was super right wing, and in practice, it was capitalistic. It's like, all that's true. But you know who else is super capitalistic and super right wing, despite being Marxist? Quite a few Marxist Leninist states. Pretty much all of them that still exist, with the exception of maybe Cuba. But like, you look at China or even the Soviet Union. So Soviet Union and the Italian fascists, okay, start off completely polar opposite. But the Bolsheviks end up going from a position of all power to the workers, all power to the Soviets, the councils, to then subordinating the councils to the party state, subordinating the unions to the state, which is what the fascists wanted to do the whole time. They
right.
ended up
And even in
basically doing what the
Italy,
fascists said they were going to do openly.
the communists actually operated in the fascist union framework until Apparismo and Autonomia developed. And I mean, the only people who at the time saw fascism as the exact same as capitalism, they were the Buldagists. It was the left faction of the Italian Communist Party that got kicked out. And they got kicked out because I mean, even though technically during third period they got what they wanted, they weren't involved in that. Partly because they said that, you don't make any allegiances with anybody to fight fascists because fascism is just another capitalist, phenomenon. And I'm like, but the funny thing is the people who would say that fascism is capitalism in crisis today would be hard pressed to take that stance that it's also not any different than any other capitalist society. They would probably get really up. They get mad with them for, let's just say that. And I just think they're not thinking it through. Like, or scratch a liberal, a fascist emerge, and like you and I say, scratch almost anybody from any group in the late 19th century, and you have a failed revolution. That's the key thing there. And you might find a fascist or a fascist-like politics, a Bonapartist politics or a Caesarist politics. And so I think that's where this all kind of falls apart. And I think the other thing that people have to deal with, if there were left and right factions of fascism, that's like there were left and right factions of Caudillismo, and there were left and right factions of Bonapartism. So it's like these things aren't so clean as we want them to be. And I mean, I do kind of blame the US school system for just a little bit. I don't know that kind of explain Canada. Well, maybe the Anglophone school system in general, because everybody likes World War II, because it's one of the few times where the English speakers don't seem like the bad guy, or at least equivalent to the bad guy, which is like two bad guys. Like, and fascistic, and I wouldn't say fascist, but fascistic thinkers like neo-reactionaries actually take advantage of pointing this out. Like, oh yeah, but that's just because you guys won and you actually had a horrible enemy, but that wasn't because your ideology was good. Like, you explicitly set up the Nuremberg trials so that even though you held everyone accountable, you exempted the shit you did. And I think Yarvin, for all he is a pernicious, terrible figure in almost all ways, I don't
Curtis
think he's
Yarvin.
entirely wrong about that.
Curtis Yarvin, right?
Curtis Yarvin, Mencius Moldbug, he writes this in Letters to a Young Progressive,
Mm-hmm.
where he points out, like, the reason why you guys are so obsessed with World War II is it makes you look good because you don't actually look at everything underneath it. And, that's why we need some good capitalist, feudalist overlords or whatever. But,
He also claimed to be more right wing than a fascist, and
yes,
that like blows the mind of a lot of left wingers. But he's being honest about that because like fascism is not the furthest thing on the right. Just
mm,
because it had a like catastrophic, horrible impact doesn't mean it's the furthest thing on the right. Friggin' Juche the North Korean regime is horrible. Juche is not the furthest thing on the right. It's just not. And it's like there's this
yeah,
kind of tendency to think like, and the right does it too with fascism, when they want to call fascism like left wing. Even
right,
Gottfried does that a little bit, which I don't like. I'm willing to say fascism is socialistic, but fascism is left wing. I mean, it's at the most, it's like kind of in the center. Like if you were to put Italian fascism, it would be really like, this terrible fucking political compass people like, the ones libertarians design. But Italian fascists would be like on the top of authoritarian, but it would be like in the center economically, whereas in culturally, whereas like you could put Nazism is more on the right because Nazism believe in the whole. I mean, that's why Hitler liked fucking Hinduism so much. He really likes hierarchies, and
right.
if the right's defined by anything, it's preference for hierarchy over equality, and in that case, Nazism is very much far on the right. Italian fascism is odd because it's not. It's like if you compare Mussolini to like a lot of dictators, there is a weird equality he appeals to, especially if you look at like Gentile's doctrine of fascism. It's this idea of like everyone is under the state, the nation state, the workers, the capitalists. We all play equal of a role, and it's odd because I find a lot of Marxist-Leninist regimes use that kind of rhetoric over time as they abandon class,
Oh,
like
yeah. I mean,
especially China, like when
well, the
they
whole
abandon
nationalist
class.
appeal
Yeah.
thing. I mean, look, I'm a China defensist. I want people to understand that. But I have pointed out over and over again that Mussolini and one of the two founders of the Communist Party of China, which wasn't Mao, was not a founder, despite what people think, both concurrently came up with the idea of a proletarian nation to justify class collaborationism. And even other Marxist Leninists, particularly Hoxha, but he wasn't the only one, so did the Soviet Union, went after the PRC for New Democracy because they said it was explicitly class collaborationist and rhymed with fascism, except that it wasn't expansionist. So like these critiques aren't new. And, I'm not a believer that the USSR is state capitalism, but I'll make people uncomfortable and say, I do think China is. I do think there are sincere socialists in the Politburo. And I think they could transition to socialism. But like it's state control capitalism, they still get disciplined by the market. Like, I don't know what to tell you. They're better at capitalism than we are, which is kind of funny, but
Yeah, it's like when we say stuff about China and these comparisons, I think people will say, "Are you saying China is like worse than the United States?" And again, it's not about worst. I really want to emphasize to understand like fascism, classical fascism, you really have to understand that if you were alive in that time period, if you don't see how you might have supported it, or at least like initially before its aftermath, might have supported it when it was, first becoming a thing, you don't understand it.
right,
Because especially if you're a socialist, that is exactly who it was appealing to. It was appealing to the socialist types, but like especially socialists, petty bourgeois background generally, but like, you know, it appealed to those sentiments. I mean, even though they were brutal with trade unionists,
Mhm.
they did have worker support. They just did.
Right.
Or else, like it wouldn't have been able to last as long as it did. The fucking fascism was in power in Italy 10 years before Hitler came to power. That's a long ass time. So, and they had far less to deal with compared to the Bolsheviks. But yeah, this idea of like, if you don't understand the appeal of it, you don't quite get it. And I think that's what I'm trying to say here is that I think like China, in terms of harm, right? In terms of bad, it's not like I'm not comparing it to fascism on that level at all. But it's the kind of thing that if there was like, you just sometimes all it takes is to. I think someone actually did do this. I saw this went viral on Twitter some time ago, but someone replaced like a Mussolini quote and put Xi Jinping instead of Mussolini, and like the fucking r/communist subreddit was praising it because
Yeah,
there's a lot of that
I have
same
done
type
that in the
of.
past too. I've actually misattributed fascist quotes to socialist thinkers to fuck with people. It's easy to do. Actually, it's ridiculously easy to do.
It's why I refrained from making that video essay I mentioned at the start, where
Mhm.
if I were to actually, go into like fascism, because there's two reasons why I'm afraid to do it. One, I'm afraid that if like a lot of people start to know fascism, some people will like realize their proximity to it, which will, on the one hand, might be good. 'Cause they'll see Marxism-Leninism today's proximity to fascism, and they'll be like
Mhm.
more skeptical of it. But it might actually lead some people to think, you know what, it's actually not that bad, which is worrying. And sometimes I think maybe we do need the noble lie of like fascism is just like this crazy, it's Nazism. Maybe it's good that actually like people don't understand it because the ACP sometimes get labeled fascist.
Mhm.
And I'm not quick to say yes because of the way people understand that term. But if I were to operate in the Italian sense, they're like very close to it. And I would
Yeah.
say that about like the Stalinist Marxist Leninists too. The Stalinist Marxist Leninists don't really disagree with the ACP on much other than like maybe trans issues and like they're maybe less sexist. They differ on social issues, but like they ultimately believe in a lot of the similar conception of socialism. Like I'm talking about the general MLs, not like Hoshists, Maoists, but
Yeah.
general MLs who believe China today is still socialist, who believe, socialism. Soviet Union was socialist until Gorbachev. Like if you believe that, and you
Yeah, I've
believe
always so Gorbachev was a socialist, but Ding is.
right, yeah,
Like
that's
that's
strange.
hard for me to and also Bukharin was really bad, but Ding recuperated Bukharin, but you like Dung, excuse me, Dung recuperated Bukharin, but you like Dung, but you don't like okay, I don't understand. But like or when I even really mess with people and tell people Xi and Dung actually disagree on a bunch of stuff, they just don't make it. She doesn't make a big deal out of that, such as
And
investment in the country thing.
she is a huge right wing shift socially. I don't think people realize that. Like Xi Jinping is also a shift left economically. And
Mhm.
that's why I think a lot of MLs like Xi in a way that they don't like previous Chinese leaders. Because I never really saw like this much, even looking back on like the American left, like not too long ago, it didn't seem like it was that common for Marxists in the West to really think China is like this vanguard of socialism until
No,
really
that's the last
Xi.
10 years thing. That's a G thing.
Yeah,
That's
and it's
supposed.
because Xi, I
Mhm.
can brings the iconography, but he also brings like a huge social shift to the right, like the Confucian turn and all that. Like like look at what she says about not just forget trans, they're like, gay people. Like it's super socially conservative. And I'm not doing that to be like, yeah, yeah, liberal imperialist, let's fuck with China. Let China do China. It's not our business. But if you're being real about what like
Well, I do think the
political ideologies here.
Neo-Confucianism thing, which was started really, really under Hu Jintao and was not undone by Xi. You would occasionally meet Chinese expats who'd like let the game slip and like, oh, you needed. The reason why China is the true socialist country is you needed 2,000 or 3,000 years of Confucianism, and I was like, Mao is rolling in his fucking grave. Like, what was the number one target culturally of the Cultural Revolution? Survey says Confucianism. Like, it's just, you know, want to point that out to you. But the other thing is, like, there was this recuperation of Bo Xilai neo-Maoism, with Xi, a reinvestment in the countryside. I mean, but he is a mixed figure. So you have this, that you've also seen a much more explicit appeals to nationalism, although not Han nationalism, but even some toleration of explicit Han nationalism, which was not usually the case under Ximen or Hu Jintao.
Well, I mean, what else would the kind of Uyghur policy be other than Han nationalism to some extent?
You could argue it under the modernization of religion ideas, but it's a
True,
little bit
yeah.
hard to do. And it is actually a step that's different because both Mao and Sun Yat-sen included Uyghurs as an explicit category in the Chinese nation, and like Mao's 18 nations of China and Sun Yat-sen's 5, Uyghurs were mentioned explicitly in both. So this push to make them assimilate into Han culture is relatively new. But I mean, even in the Politburo, there's some like more Han nationalist talk that has generally been allowed historically. That said, it's also very hard for, I mean, like most Marxist-Leninists in America and Canada know what Red Sales or maybe the Monthly Review says about they don't read Mandarin. They're not even reading Chinese communists. They're reading Western people interpreting Chinese communism for them, which, not ideal.
Or like a Western academic with a suspicious job in a Chinese university.
Yeah,
He lives in China and never comes out and talks about anything unless it's praising China.
right. Right. Yeah.
Certain figures.
Certain figures
Uh,
not to be named.
yeah.
But yeah, I have noticed such a trend where I'm like, I wonder where they work. Oh. So, yeah, I mean,
None of this I say is to be too pejorative about China. Like, I'm not even. So here's the thing: when it comes to class collaborations, I'm not a Maoist. Like, I think there's many cases historically and currently where you could argue that it's the pragmatic approach. I mean, Mao did to some extent, but with lower classes, you know, and like there's a national bourgeoisie was seen as progressive in third world countries. I mean, like, I'm not. I'm just trying to like see what these phenomenon are, like, just be accurate, right? I don't try to say like any of this to say China is like some kind of reactionary hellscape that the American gracious liberal vanguard needs to go defeat in a cold war or whatever. Like,
absolutely
that's
not.
not, we're not Ann Applebaums here. However, I did find it revealing about like these ideologies and what like the poor excuse of what Marxism is today, and this kind of like Marxism-Leninism. And there was this debate between one of the MAGACOM guys, I forget if it was Haas Aldine or Jackson Hinkle was one of them, with a famous Nazi influencer, third positionist. If you've heard of Keith Woods.
Oh, Keith Woods. Yeah, I've heard of Keith Woods.
Yeah, they had a debate, and another guy called Joel Ortiz, or wait, no,
yeah, I was about to say, and I mean, the MAGA communists also got endorsed by a third positionist. So, but anyway, go ahead.
So they had this debate, and it was really revealing where, basically like the MAGA communist guy was trying to really make the case that China was like the proof of Marxism-Leninism's infallible truth. And, the Nazi guy was making the point that like China today is actually closer to our systems than yours. It's closer to being a third positionist country, at least in the Italian kind, not in the Nazi kind. And that like they're really nationalist, they're socially on the right, and economically they're more closer to the economic model of fascism than they are to like what the Soviet Union had.
Nick Land
And
used to say the same thing.
and it's like, are they wrong? That's what's fucked up.
I
Are
mean,
they
I
wrong
have
about
pointed
that?
out that like for a while it's like, the left likes China and the far right likes China. And okay, I can see how that could be, but for different reasons. But what's disturbing is when they like them for the same reasons. It's like, and like I said, I'm a Chinese defenses. I'm pretty strongly a Chinese defenses, but I'm also not an ideologist or a liar. And I think the idea that we can treat China as a unitary phenomenon, like it's just like it's pure Marxist-Leninism. I'm like, no, it's not. I mean, I guess my last thought is I used to get mad actually. There was a tendency. Domenico Lacerda doesn't do this as much as his fans do, but there was a whole Midwestern Marx book that did this. the purity fetish
Purity
book.
fetish.
And I pointed out that, like, they at points, I'm like, you're just lying that the capitalist road opposition and these different forms of Maoism didn't come out of China, because they absolutely did. And if you knew the history of China, you would know that. But your history of China starts in 1982, because the other thing you're doing is like, we can defend socialist Cambodia and socialist Vietnam. I'm like, no, you can't. You can't defend them both. You can't. It's impossible. Like, you know, who killed the most Marxist-Leninists in the 20th century? Marxist-Leninists?
You know what I hate is a defense that is a very lazy. Anytime there's any kind of comparison between actually existing Marxism-Leninism and fascism, the typical response is to, one, dismiss it as like you're trying to say they're equally as bad, which is not what I'm saying at all, and that they are the same intent. Obviously not in terms of intent, but that, what does it really matter? As compared to like what they actually do and how they governed. Now you look at like the governing thing, the way in which they try to defend against that is Marxist-Leninists will say, well, who defeated fascism? It wasn't the British. It was ultimately the Soviet Union. But it's like after they invaded them, after
Yeah.
the Nazis broke their pact,
Do you know who
their
provided
fucking
most
pact,
of
and
the...
like Stalin fucking called Hitler an anti-imperialist.
Yeah, I was about to say, you know who provided the Wehrmacht with most of its steel?
Soviet Union?
Soviet Union.
I didn't even know that.
You know who trained a lot of Wehrmacht generals? Soviet Union. All right. I mean, I'm like, yeah, we could not have defeated Hitler without the Russians. Absolutely true. The Russians took the brunt of the damage. Absolutely true too. But the war that Stalin was preparing for was not the war with Hitler. It was the war of Britain and France. Like, and yes, he made forays to Britain. Britain rejected it. Then he made forays to Hitler. Hitler didn't. And then, I mean, Stalin couldn't believe. He really didn't seem to believe. And I know this from reading stuff about when his own people were like, dude, they're
Right.
massing forces at the border. He didn't think it was possible, frankly, because he thought Hitler was rational, which was dumb. And it was a shock to him when it happened. Now, I know that makes people very uncomfortable because I'm like, yes, we couldn't have defeated the Wehrmacht without the Soviet Union. There's also an argument to be made that without the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the Wehrmacht wouldn't have happened to be able to get as far as it did. People, we don't want to deal with that. Like, it was unclear for multiple. And that what's crazy about that is Hitler never dropped his anti-communism, not once. And the settling of the East was always his plan. So it's just, now Stalin did think he was going to eventually have to fight Hitler. He did, but he thought he was going to have to defeat Britain and France first. And he had no idea where the Americans were going to go. And
what's the oddest thing is when they try to justify the pact is they come up with all this ideology, because that's the problem with a system where its legitimacy is based in the fucking proletarian party. It doesn't have any elections that can boot it out of power. They have to justify everything they're fucking doing all the time. So like during the pact, you get all this weird ass ideology, which is like, the Hitler is like an anti-imperialist potentially, like, and you get the, well, actually, I mean, they're not any social democrats.
With Imperial Japan for way longer than they did with Hitler too. I mean, like, that doesn't get dropped by the Comintern until like 1942. And there were American Marxist-Leninists, including people I deeply respect, like W.E.B. Du Bois, who never dropped it. It's weird.
Yeah, that Japan was an anti-imperialist force, which makes sense why Du Bois might have thought that, given the kind of racial component I play with Japan and how they were depicted. But like, it's odd that the Soviets believe that the Comintern ever believed that.
Right.
That's
Even though
really
they were
odd.
also preparing for an invasion by doing arguably racist stuff, like deporting all the Koreans into, Uzbekistan, so they wouldn't side with the Japanese, which it didn't make any sense to me, because I think, like, if I was if I was going to predict who would help you kill Japanese people, it would have been Koreans and Russia. But
That's just pure racism at that point that they thought like they wouldn't. That is just pure racism. Can't rationalize that.
and it's just most
No.
people don't know this history. Like, but I'm like, do you know why there's so many Koreans in Uzbekistan? Even now, it's not because they chose to migrate to Uzbekistan. I'll tell you that. You know, the ethnic Koreans were mostly in either out of Mongolia or they were in what would like Vladivostok, which makes sense. Like Vladivostok is literally like a 2-hour boat ride. Well, 2-hour modern boat ride. So probably like a 12-hour boat ride back in the day. And also the Russo-Japanese War is, you know, areas of former Korean territory were divided up between China, Russia, and Japan. So, and thank you, Teddy Roosevelt, for settling that, I guess. But again, most people don't know this history. Like, and so they can't make the comparisons. And no, I mean, the thing that you'll hear is like, I bet you we're both going to be accused of being anti-communist. And I'm like, I'm not particularly I'm not anti-communist at all. I just want people to be honest about
Well,
these situations.
they define anti-communism as you're like anti-Bolshevik, like, or not even anti-Bolshevik, anti-Soviet, like, period. And even then, it's like I probably would have been one of these people who might have like not been anti-Soviet until probably the invasions of Czechoslovakia. I
Yeah.
probably would have jumped ship just because, like, at that point, like, I think a lot of people really wanted to believe the Soviet Union could be something, and I think it could have. I really think it could have. I don't think it was doomed. It really could have reformed, but like it showed that it never wanted. It had no intention to do so, and then when it tried, it was way too late, and it did it horribly.
I was about to say, but when it tried to democratize in the 80s, it was already completely subject to IMF loans and falling apart and had terrorized its apparatchiks for so long, no one could run anything. And like, I just find it odd how mad people get about, I mean, the other thing is how mad people get about the secret speech. And I'm like, you know, that Mao said a lot of the same things about Stalin. He just sided with Stalin's
Ah,
whatever, and mostly for a plea for legitimacy.
that's it. Yeah, I point that out in my video because a lot of people like to talk about the secret speech like it was like Khrushchev is bad but why? Why is Khrushchev bad? And people like to say, well, it's an anti-revisionism thing, but it's a legitimacy thing because why did Deng and Mao agree that Khrushchev's secret speech was bad? Because obviously Deng was very open to the kind of market reforms, much more aggressive market reforms than Khrushchev ever even touched, right? So why is Deng, see what Khrushchev did as bad? It's because he ultimately exposed the truth of what was happening,
Right.
like, which is, this cult of personality, the kind of all the gulag system. Whereas, China learned from that and they were like, we're gonna like actually do the opposite of all of Mao's policies while also like praising Mao and saying how great he is.
Yeah. So like, yeah, like 80% good, 20% bad, which is the same thing, by the way, that Mao said about Stalin. What Deng said about Mao was Mao said about Stalin, but also like Mao did criticize Stalin for killing too many Bolsheviks. Like that was
But
explicit.
in a kind of very like some more subtle way, right?
Mhm.
Compared to because that's the thing, they tried this whole comradely self-criticism thing. Like that really did exist. But the problem is in this like highly dictatorial system, like who gets power through like coup d'etats. That's why I think anyone who thinks you can just recreate this system is so delusional. Like it is not an ideal system. Literally, like every change of power in the Soviet Union happened from the leader dying or from a coup. Like Stalin and Khrushchev dying, Khrushchev removed in a coup, Brezhnev dies, friggin' the next three guys die.
Yeah.
Gorbachev basically gets there through kind of coup. I mean, Khrushchev came through a coup.
Yeah.
Even after Stalin died, there's that whole. Definitely want to watch a movie about this. The death of Stalin depicts it in a pretty funny way.
It's not particularly historically accurate in a lot of ways, but But the other thing is like people go after like, oh, they try to defend Beria. Beria's a monster. But the other thing is, if you actually read Beria's plans, he was even more market reformist than Gorbachev, like way more. So it's just like,
So was Andropov too, except
yeah,
Andropov just was more of a police state guy, like
right.
more of a authoritarian.
So what you
So
guys
they
just
like
like,
that about him.
you like the KGB, like lovely.
Well, because that's what it's about when you have like one party in power. That's a group of elites. That's the kind of thing I think is flawed in it. If I am to go a little extra mile, like I don't think Marxism is inherently authoritarian or anything, but the big flaw is Marxism sees everything in terms of class and not elites or hierarchy. And actually, I think that's where anarchists do get it right, is that sometimes it is more about hierarchy. Or if you at least are going to do the class thing, you have to at least look at the bureaucracy as a class, right? Because
Right.
if you
And
don't,
your way to control the bureaucracy shouldn't be to just randomly kill them every 10 years.
yeah, or just randomly unleash protests of students to scare the shit out of them.
Right. I mean, I will say when people talk about the Cultural Revolution versus the purges, I'm like, the Cultural Revolution was bad. I mean, you and I had an argument once where it's like, I still think it prevented the Civil War, but it was bad. But it wasn't the purges. They didn't go out and just like mass execute dissidents. Executions did happen, but most of it was actually street fighting and mass suicides after shamings and that sort of thing. It was not, you know, like systematic. Big frankly, because if Mao got rid of all of his internal opposition, Deng would have been dead. So, he Russificated Deng, but he didn't kill him.
Kind of helped bring him back to power.
Yeah, I mean, he brought Deng back to power and also empowered a group, a centrist group that everyone forgets about called the Nothingness, that were technically in charge from 78 to 82, but they did so little that even when we recall it, we don't remember them in history. Like, Deng consolidates his power in 81, and then they rewrite the Constitution in 82. Which also leads to weird things like today, whereas the Constitution says that China's in its socialist period, people will say, well, we're building towards socialist modernization, or we're building socialism, and socialism will occur in like 2050. And it's just, it feels like it's always getting pushed back, but is also, they're already supposed to be there. And that's from China's own rhetoric. That's not me being an asshole. Like, it's just officially
Didn't Jack
state
Ma
sanctioned
say they're
policy.
ready for socialism? Or one of the Chinese billionaires said that like China's actually already ready for socialism.
Right.
Then he got like disciplined after.
Right.
He got a little talk.
Well, I
from
mean,
the
my other
NSI.
thing is, I love it when people quote Engels about this and socialism, utopian, and scientific, and then in the same sentence that they'll skip, he says that we have the stuff for socialism in 1888. So it's like, come on, guys, like it's always further out, like really, like, but yeah, it's
Yeah, it's about being realist about what it is, as opposed to being good or bad. Because it's like, has China made good? Has the Communist Party improved China in the
absolutely.
last 30 years? Like undoubtedly. Like it is the most. If you look at like in terms of what they had to deal with, it is probably the most successful capitalist state ever.
It's
Just
also
like
brought the
period.
most people out of poverty, like
Yeah.
probably ever. But so I'm not here to shit on China for what, but also at the same token, I'm also like, but guys, you can't just call everything. I mean, the thing is, like, you eventually get with like MAGA communists. They'll claim that the United States has been socialist since like 1842 because of an article Engels wrote about the Owenites. Like, it's
But
before
do
he
they
even met
actually
Marx,
claim that?
huh?
Do they actually say that?
Yes.
Really?
Do they believe it? I don't think so, but they've said it. I mean,
Or that like when they say socialist, do they mean like America is socialist, or that it's just like part of American culture or something?
no, I think they argue that basically the entire world's already socialist because. But this is what I say: MAGA communist beliefs are actually way weirder than people realize, and they're pulled from a variety of decontextualized things from the past. But they pull a lot from Stalin, sincerely. So,
Which is odd. Like the anti-revisionist synthesis with this ultra revisionist current is odd, which really ties it together. The only thing that ties it together is this anti-liberal sort of politics, and I think that's why it's not a coincidence, in my view, that you have people like Dugin kind of prop up in the MAGA communist circles when but Dugan, I mean, explicitly in some of his older work, would say communism and Marxism are actually much more in line with liberalism than anything he would
Oh, he
want.
does. Actually, even in the fourth political theory, he says that. But he says that there's a myth that you can take advantage of Marxists and use them as a fifth column, and he says it outright. And people just like do 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 do, and I'm like,
Yeah,
you
you
read the
mentioned
book,
this in
right?
your I think one of your podcasts. I got to link that one. That's people should check that one. I forget which was it with Donald when you were talking about that, or
I
was it
talked
just
about it with Donald, and I also talked about it in like the third or fourth in a series I did where we read. We're gonna pick it back up, but we read like of for political theory, and I was like, he says it literally right here, like we will use Marxists as a way to beat down liberalism, but that's it. They're being used as a cynical fifth column. He just outright says it.
I mean, that makes sense. People think that is how could that be possible? These guys aren't real communists, but like, I mean, the Russians been doing this. Like, the Russian Communist Party is like controlled opposition,
Right.
and will like basically use like neo-Stalinist rhetoric to justify what Putin does.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like ranging from the wars to the policies to defending Putin straight up. Like, it's not like it hasn't been done before. And if there's one lesson I think of all of this, I mean, there's many lessons here, but like this anti-liberalism to be a basis of unity, like anti-liberal unity, it's never worked, and it's kind of having a sort of resurgence now. And I think it's just always bad. Like, it's stupid in so many ways. It's stupid because one, like, there isn't a real basis of unity there, and two, it's also like, why would you unify on all the worst things of both ideologies? Like, if there's one thing I hated most about actually existing, like Bolshevism, is it's actually anti-liberalism, and I mean that politically more than economically. In that, like, civil liberties and all that,
Mhm.
because like, you know, ultimately, like, sure, like, I can see why Stalin and a lot of people in the Comintern back in the day were able to rationalize to themselves that, like, maybe Hitler is actually less hostile to the Soviet Union than Britain and France, because they think that, like, Britain and France are more capitalist and are more powerful, that they're gonna be worse and more hostile, but it's and, because ultimately, like, Germany, they subordinate capital under the state, and that's the problem. Is like, you see Marxist-Leninists today will praise countries for, like, disciplining their billionaires as if that's inherently socialist,
Yeah, I was about to say we
and
used to do that
why
too.
they like Putin a lot of the time. They will defend Putin because 'cause they're like, "Oh, well, at least he disciplines the oligarchs," and it's like, well, first off, like,
Which ones?
which ones? Yeah. But it's
Yeah, I
like,
mean,
that's literally Bonapartism. That's not fucking that brings us full circle. Like, that's literally like, Louis Bonaparte did that, and Marx wrote about it. Like, the 3rd,
mhm.
Napoleon the
Right.
3rd.
Oh yeah, I know. It's fun.
It's like, he wrote about it, guys. Like, the guy who's in the name of your ideology, Marxism-Leninism, he criticized that.
Yeah, he
And my
also
favorite
hated.
hate social democracy is like, look, I would respect it if they at least, like, if they're gonna define socialism this vague ass way, then they have to call, like, Sweden and Norway socialist, which I don't. But
Mhm.
if we're gonna use that terminology, you have to be consistent. Why do you hate Sweden and Norway and think that they aren't really socialists, but you think all these this sort of like, you think like Vietnam and its sweatshops is like socialist? It's like, give me a break. If you're to be consistent here, you know, and they'll say, okay, well, it's because they say they're moving to socialism. So did Olaf Palme.
Mm,
Olaf Palme in the 70s, and as Prime Minister of Sweden, said Sweden was closer to socialism than the Soviet Union was.
right. Yeah, it's a lot of cope, man. I mean, it's. I think about it in a way. I had a friend of me who was a left communist, and he found the truth of Dungism around 2017, and then I think he became a Christian or something. But which I think we'll see a lot of that.
That's
But
another topic.
he told me he became a Dungist primarily because he just had to believe socialism was real and already existed somewhere. And what better place than China? And I was like, that is the most motivated ass reasoning I've ever heard in my life. What do you think socialism is? And I couldn't get an answer from him. I was like, it's not the state running everything. Like, which China doesn't do anyway. So it's just like, or it's like, oh, they shoot. And I'm like, we used to do stuff to relegate oligarchs too. That's just, you live in a society where we have given up all that sometimes, not even all the time. And so anything, I mean, it just seems like a radical, like, it's not even just a radical diminution of what communism is. It's like a radical diminution of what social democracy was. Like, you know, but anyway.
Well, I think it's because they see, because America ultimately is like one of the closest things you have to like a real dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. Like
Yes, absolutely.
if you believe in that theory of the state, which I don't, unless you take the Polanski's route of changing the Marxist theory of the state to make it so general that it's not even really the Marxist theory of the state anymore. I will accept that because that's more nuanced. But like the idea of a capitalist running the state, very rarely in capitalist states does that actually ever happen. But in America, that is the case. You do have like, and even then, it's not so overt, but it's more overt than it is in most capitalist states. So it's easy to see why like people will like, oh, China, what they do, they discipline billionaires. If only they did that to Elon Musk. But like, back in the day, fucking Teddy Roosevelt kind of did that, right? And it's not at all odd for, it's like actually a much better functioning capitalist state will discipline its capitalists. The idea that they don't, the odd thing. This idea of dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, I think American the American centricness of like the Western left, or the fact that it's maybe America is so big that so much of the Western left just is Americans,
Mhm.
I think is why you get like this sort of thinking. Because if you take like America as a model of a capitalist state, it's actually the exception. But if you judge what you know about capitalism, the state on America, you get a really distorted picture of how everything is. Like Lewis Hartz in his founding of New Societies, he makes the point that America was actually the only ever like true, you know, like capitalist state, in that it was like a state run by capitalists for capitalists. Whereas like you get like Australia, where like the unions are for a long time debatably just as powerful as
Mhm.
the corporations are for a long period, if not more. You know,
Yeah,
and
that's
it's like would we call that a socialist? It's like I think America just being as corporate as it is distorts people and lowers the expectation for what any kind of socialist politics is, to the point where all you have to do is like put sin taxes on a billionaire, maybe give one jail time every once in a while, and then you'll make enough people happy.
yeah. I mean, we were talking about people who would make a radical case for somehow like Huey Long being the most socialist figure in America history, which may be even true, but it's just that's a real low bar. Like, yeah. The other thing is, I think so many of our models of governments are just well, maybe I shouldn't say just Bonapartist. They're just Caesarist. They're just like populist, one guy running. You know, which I have non-Marxist theories for why I think that's become so complex, so easy for people to adapt, and that's because our societies are super complex now, and it's just really easy to imagine one guy simplifying that by being one guy and running everything. Which, if you look historically, what they mostly do is run it into the ground. But it's I mean, even arguably even Stalin, because it's like, oh, Stalin. I'm like, well, dude, after Stalin, even by your standards, you don't get good leadership out of the Soviet Union. You just don't. I guess some of you guys like Brezhnev sometimes, but if they were so successful, maybe they would have lasted 100 years,
Brezhnev.
right?
That's like, if there's actually any man that resembles the ideology of general Marxist Leninists today, it's Brezhnev, because Brezhnev takes what I call in my next video the "don't ask, don't tell" approach to Stalin, which is like to not ever condemn anything he does, but also at the same time to not like advocate the most like insane anti-revisionist justifications for purging everybody. You know,
Right.
the
It's
extremism.
yeah.
So it's like, but also like, let's not acknowledge anything that was wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that is definitely the case. And it's just basic. Yeah, it is don't ask, don't care about history. It is, ironically, it is what the same thing that Dung does, which is like, it's just historical nihilism to even discuss it, really. And that was that purity fetish stuff out of Midwestern Marx before they became MAGA comps. Is it was just like, don't talk about internal divisions of socialist history. We'll admit that they happen sometimes, but we're not talking about it because that's just going to empower the way. And I'm like, how does it empower your enemies to not admit where you screwed up? Like, if you want to build a society that lasts, why won't you talk about what failed? And it's just like, well, they were surrounded by imperial. I'm like, that was always going to happen. Every socialist forever should have known they were going to be surrounded by imperialists who were going to fight them. Like, that's not an excuse.
It's also not even like that brings us to a whole other territory. But I recommend people check out this video by NOJ Rants. It's a pretty well produced video on the Bolsheviks and the Soviets and how the Bolsheviks actually kind of accelerated the Civil War by essentially like making it impossible for the other parties, namely the SRs, the right and left SRs, and the Mensheviks to compete peacefully for power with the Bolsheviks, because that kind of pushed a lot of people, you know, into thinking that there wasn't a way to work within the state. So like what could have happened, and a lot of these people didn't even join the whites, but they didn't join the Reds either. So like you just had a lot of people sit out of the Civil War who could have been on the Bolshevik side because of that. And some people in the right SRs fucking joined the whites because they were like excluded. So it's like there's not only is the whole Civil War thing, like they act like the Civil War started and then the one party state happened. But the one party state happened way before the fucking Civil War. The main part of the Civil War started when the country started sending in troops, right?
Right.
Because the Civil War starts immediately in the Revolution, right? Technically, if you count like Kornilov,
Yeah,
right?
I mean,
Or like
deal with
the
the
foreign
Red
countries,
Terror
the
and
the
all that stuff.
encirclement doesn't start till after
Right.
the one party state.
Right. Or the fact they couldn't get the peasants on board, or, there's just a bunch of issues that a lot of people don't want to deal with about that time period. And yeah, I mean, as soon as they, I know it wasn't democratic enough, but as soon as they get rid of the People's Assembly and they kick out the SRs and then use the terror to finish purging the SRs. Now, admittedly, the
The
SRs weren't
Constituent
killing
Assembly.
Bolsheviks.
You mean the Constituent Assembly?
Yeah, the Constituent
Right,
Assembly,
right.
excuse me. I got to be very technical because you're right, because but
Well, because there's a People's Assembly, right? And like
there's
China.
a People's Assembly too. And the People's
People's
Assembly
Congress.
never gets disbanded, even like it exists, I think, technically throughout the whole Soviet Union. But the Constituent Assembly is disbanded, and then the faction ban goes in. Now there were factions. There was two oppositions. There was two different left oppositions. There is a right opposition, but formally there were no factions after 1921. But all that starts pretty early. That's all that you start seeing that stuff develop in 1920.
Anyhow, there's a lot we could talk about, but as promised, for the little time we have left in the back room, we are going to talk about a topic which you brought up actually, and I think in our last conversation. And it kind of came out of nowhere, but it's fascinating, and it has to be the back room only because it's far too. It's just I'm curious where it goes, but you basically brought up an observation you made, which is the kind of sexual politics of the left. There being a sort of contradictory mixture of, on the one hand, a sort of sexual libertinism, like a kind of, praise of sex work, a kind of rejection, even as far of like marriage, or even as far as monogamy itself, preferring these kind of more bohemian sexual trends. To, on the other hand, a kind of sexual puritanicalism that is very wants to regulate sex, for often like noble purposes, for preventing, sex crimes and stuff. But like certainly causing a tension nonetheless between these two different trends. We're going to discuss that in the back room. If you're not part of the back room already, living under a rock, and you get access to tons of exclusive content. If you're not a member at this point, I don't know what to tell you. Become one. It's
Yeah.
cheaper. It's very, very cheap, and you get a lot. Yeah. See you in
Right.
the back room.
My only hope is that when enough people become pessimist, then out of despair somebody maybe does something. But you know why I also like to be a pessimist? Because it's the only way to have a nice life. If you're an optimist, then always bad things happen and you are always disappointed. When you are a pessimist, then you look around, okay, there are bad, but from time to time something nice happens and you are, as a pessimist, you are a little bit glad all the time, no?
You are listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.